The man who opened the cabin door did not scream. He did not step back. He simply stood there, frozen, staring at what remained of a family that had once laughed, prayed, and dreamed of a better life. Inside the dark, smoke-stained shelter, a woman sat cross-legged near the fire. Her face was hollow, her eyes sunken so deeply they seemed carved into her skull. She did not react to the stranger standing before her. She was holding something between her fingers. At first glance, it looked like a piece of dried leather. Then the man realized it was human flesh. In the corner of the cabin lay bones, carefully stripped clean. Cracked open with deliberate precision. The marrow removed. The skull set aside, almost respectfully. No animals. No deer. No cattle. Only people. One rescuer later wrote that he had marched across battlefields littered with bodies, but nothing prepared him for the quiet of that cabin. Because these people had not been murdered. They had not been attacked. They had starved. And in the silence of the mountains, hunger had rewritten every rule they once lived by. Long pause. This was not the work of savages or criminals. These were American families, parents, children, newlyweds, who set out on a hopeful journey west. What followed would become one of the darkest survival stories ever recorded. This is the true story of the Donner Party. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must return to America in the mid-19th century, a country restless, expanding, and convinced that destiny itself lay beyond the horizon. It was 1846. The United States was still young, but its ambitions were enormous. Newspapers spoke openly of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were meant to spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific, no matter the cost. California, at that time, was the crown jewel. It was still Mexican territory, sparsely populated, described by travelers as a land of rich soil, mild weather, and endless opportunity. To farmers struggling in the Midwest, it sounded like salvation. Land back east was expensive. Opportunities were limited. But out west, you could start over. You could own land. You could build something that would outlive you. By the mid-1840s, thousands of families were selling their homes, packing their belongings into wooden wagons, and joining long caravans heading west along the Oregon and California trails. The journey was brutal, but most believed it was survivable. They were told it would take 4 to 6 months. They were told supplies would be enough. They were told the trails were well-traveled and safe. What they were not told was how unforgiving the land could become when even one decision went wrong. The Donner Party was not a group of reckless thrill-seekers. They were not explorers chasing glory. They were families. Farmers. Parents. Children. Grandparents. People who had lived ordinary lives before history pulled them into something extraordinary and horrifying. George Donner. George Donner was 62 years old in 1846, already considered elderly by frontier standards. He was a successful farmer from Illinois, known among his neighbors as steady, thoughtful, and reliable. He had survived hardship before and believed preparation and patience could overcome almost anything. He traveled with his wife, Tamsen Donner, a deeply religious, educated woman who had worked as a schoolteacher. She was known for her compassion and calm demeanor. George was not reckless. But he trusted people. That trust would cost him dearly. Jacob Donner. Jacob Donner, George's younger brother, was physically strong and practical, a man suited to frontier life. He often took on leadership roles within the wagon train, helping repair wagons and manage livestock. Together, the Donner brothers were seen as pillars of the group. People trusted them, followed them. Pause. James Reed. James Reed was different. He was wealthy, educated, and ambitious, a businessman rather than a farmer. He traveled with his wife Margaret and their 4 children. Reed was confident, persuasive, and used to making decisions. He believed strongly in efficiency, progress, and taking calculated risks. That confidence would later divide the group. And eventually, destroy it. In April of 1846, around 87 people gathered near Springfield, Illinois, preparing to begin the long journey west. They formed a wagon train, not a single family, but multiple households traveling together for safety and cooperation. There were elderly men, pregnant women, teenagers, infants who could not yet walk. This was not a military expedition. It was a moving village. They carried food, tools, livestock, weapons, clothing, and keepsakes from home. Many believed they would never see Illinois again. Some wouldn't. There was already one problem. They were leaving late. Most experienced emigrants departed earlier in the spring to ensure they crossed the mountains before winter. The Donner Party left in April. Time was already against them. But optimism was strong. And optimism can be dangerous. As the wagon train moved westward across the plains, they followed well-worn trails used by thousands before them. The journey was difficult, but manageable. Then, in Wyoming, they encountered a promise that changed everything. A shortcut. It was called the Hastings Cutoff. The idea came from a man named Lansford Hastings, a writer and promoter who claimed to know a faster route to California. Hastings promised that his cutoff would save weeks of travel by avoiding the traditional northern route. He wrote letters. He sent guides. He marketed the route aggressively. There was just one problem. Hastings had never led a full wagon train through it. Some members of the Donner Party were skeptical. Experienced travelers warned that shortcuts were often deadly. But time was slipping away. And James Reed pushed hard in favor of the cutoff. He argued that delay was more dangerous than risk. George Donner hesitated. Then, he agreed. That decision, a single turn off the established trail, would lead the Donner Party into one of the worst disasters in American history. The moment they turned onto the Hastings Cutoff, reality set in. This was not a trail. It was barely a path. Instead of open plains, the wagons were forced into the Wasatch Mountains, steep, forested, and largely unexplored. Trees blocked the way. Wagons had to be dismantled and dragged piece by piece. Men spent entire days chopping through dense forest just to advance a few hundred yards. Oxen collapsed from exhaustion. Supplies were consumed faster than planned. Weeks were lost. Morale deteriorated. Arguments broke out. The group began to fracture, not physically yet, but emotionally. Trust weakened. Fear grew. Winter crept closer. By late summer, the Donner Party reached the edge of the Great Salt Lake Desert, an 80-mile stretch of flat, blinding salt flats. It was one of the most dangerous sections of the journey. There was no shade. No fresh water. No game. Hastings had claimed it could be crossed in 2 days. It took nearly a week. Water supplies ran out. Oxen, driven mad by thirst, broke free and wandered into the desert, never to return. Wagons were abandoned. Children cried through the night. One survivor later wrote that the ground burned their feet through their shoes. By the time they crossed, dozens of animals were dead. The party emerged weaker, slower, and dangerously behind schedule. Winter was no longer a distant concern. It was approaching fast. As stress mounted, tempers snapped. In October of 1846, during a heated argument over wagons and animals, a fight broke out between James Reed and a teamster named John Snyder. Witnesses reported shouting. Then chaos. Then blood. Reed stabbed Snyder. Snyder died shortly afterward. The wagon train was thrown into crisis. This was not an accident. This was murder. The group held a vote. They could not execute Reed. There was no jail, no authority, no law beyond the trail. So they made another choice. James Reed was banished. He was forced to leave the group and continue alone, across mountains, deserts, and hostile territory. His wife Margaret watched him ride away, knowing she might never see him again. She now had 4 children to protect. And winter was nearly upon them. After the desert, a broken company. When the Donner Party emerged from the Great Salt Lake Desert, they were no longer the same group that had entered it. They were thinner, quieter, angrier. Oxen had been lost. Wagons abandoned. Supplies consumed far faster than planned. Shoes were worn through. Clothing hung loose on bodies already weakened by hunger and exhaustion. But the most dangerous thing they carried out of the desert was not physical. It was distrust. The Hastings Cutoff, once spoken of with optimism, was now cursed openly. Whispers moved through the wagons at night. Who had pushed for this? Who was to blame? James Reed's name came up again and again. And only days later, blood was spilled. The killing of John Snyder, consequences on the trail. Soft, tense underscore. The argument that killed John Snyder was not sudden. It was the result of weeks of resentment and fear. Snyder was a teamster, a hired driver responsible for handling oxen and wagons. He had clashed with James Reed before, accusing him of arrogance and poor judgment. On October 5, 1846, tempers finally exploded. Accounts differ, but witnesses agree on the outcome. Reed stabbed Snyder with a knife. Snyder fell from his wagon and died soon after. The wagon train froze in place, not from cold, but from shock. This was no longer a disagreement. This was a death. There was no sheriff. No judge. No prison. Only frightened families in the wilderness, days away from winter storms. They held a council. Some demanded execution. Others argued Reed had acted in self-defense. But fear ruled the decision. They banished him. James Reed was ordered to leave the wagon train immediately. He was given minimal supplies. No escort. No protection. Margaret Reed watched her husband disappear into the wilderness, riding east, away from California, away from his children, away from safety. She did not cry. She later wrote that she was too afraid to cry. James Reed turned once, raised his hand, and rode away. It was the last time many believed they would ever see him. A man alone, James Reed's survival. Wind through open land. James Reed now faced the wilderness alone. He had no wagon. No companions. Only a horse, limited food, and the knowledge that winter was closing in. Many expected him to die. He did not. Reed traveled east, then south, surviving on whatever he could find. He relied on sheer determination, trading where possible, stealing when necessary, and pressing forward despite injury and illness. At one point, he was robbed and left with almost nothing. At another, he nearly froze to death. But Reed was driven by a single thought: his children. He believed, desperately, that if he could reach California, he could raise a rescue party. That belief kept him alive. Meanwhile, the rest of the wagon train struggled westward. They were dangerously behind schedule. Snow had already begun dusting the higher peaks. Experienced emigrants knew what that meant. If they did not cross the Sierra Nevada soon, they would be trapped. George Donner urged caution but also speed, a contradiction that reflected the group's confusion. Wagons broke down faster than they could be repaired. Oxen collapsed and were butchered on the trail. Families argued over rations. Parents began lying to their children, telling them food was coming soon. Pause. It wasn't. Wind rises, distant thunder. By late October 1846, the Donner Party reached the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Snow began falling almost immediately. At first, it was light, beautiful even. Children reached out to catch flakes on their tongues. But within days, storms intensified. Snow fell relentlessly. Trails vanished. Drifts rose higher than wagon wheels. Oxen struggled, then failed. One by one, wagons were abandoned. They were running out of time. On October 31st, the Donner Party made a final push toward the mountain pass. They didn't make it. A massive snowstorm blocked the route completely. The Sierra Nevada had closed. They were trapped. Quiet snowfall ambience. With no way forward or back, the party split into two main groups. One settled near a frozen alpine lake, later named Donner Lake. They built crude cabins from logs, canvas, and wagon parts. Another group, including the Donner family, was forced to camp miles away at Alder Creek, with even fewer supplies. Both locations were death traps. Snow piled higher each day. Food dwindled rapidly. Game disappeared. The lake froze solid. They slaughtered their remaining cattle. Then their horses. Then dogs. They boiled bones. They scraped hides. They chewed leather. Starvation had begun. Hunger does not kill quickly. It weakens. It hollows. It changes people. Children stopped playing. Adults stopped talking. People lay in their bunks, conserving energy, staring at nothing. Parents secretly gave their rations to their children, and grew weaker as a result. Some refused food out of despair. Others stole. Trust collapsed. One survivor later wrote, "Our suffering was beyond description. Snowstorms isolated the camps completely. Weeks passed. No rescue came. Winter tightened its grip. By December, it was clear they could not wait. A small group decided to attempt the impossible, cross the mountains on foot through deep snow. They fashioned crude snowshoes from ox yokes and rawhide. 17 people set out. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. The name was not poetic. It was accurate. They carried minimal food. Some carried children. They disappeared into the white silence of the mountains. Those left behind watched until they vanished. Many believed they would never be seen again. The Forlorn Hope, hunger on the march. The Forlorn Hope suffered almost immediately. Snowshoes broke. Feet froze. People collapsed and were left behind. Food ran out within days. One by one, members died. And then, the unthinkable happened. The dead were not buried. They were used. This was the first confirmed act of cannibalism among the Donner Party. It was not discussed. It was endured. Some refused to eat and died as a result. Others survived because they didn't refuse. The group staggered onward for weeks. Only a handful survived to reach help. They brought word of the trapped families. But help would come slowly. Too slowly. While the Forlorn Hope struggled through the mountains, those left behind sank deeper into despair. Deaths became common. The dead were kept inside the cabins because the ground was frozen solid. Bodies lay beneath blankets. At first, they were treated with respect. Then, they became food. No one spoke of it openly. Children were turned away. Parents cried silently at night. Morality dissolved under starvation. This was not madness. It was survival stripped to its bones. By late October of 1846, the Donner Party was no longer moving toward California. California had stopped being a destination. It had become an idea, a memory, something whispered around dying campfires like a prayer that no longer reached anyone. They were now trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And winter had arrived early. The first snow. On October 28, 1846, the first snow fell. At first, it seemed harmless. Just a dusting, light flakes drifting down through the pine trees, settling quietly on wagon covers and oxen hides. Children laughed. Some of the men even smiled. Snow meant water, snow meant relief from dust. But the mountains knew something the travelers didn't. This wasn't the beginning of winter. This was the warning. Within days, the snow thickened. The narrow mountain trails vanished beneath white drifts. Wagons sank axle-deep. Oxen slipped and fell. Every mile forward required hours of digging, pushing, dragging. Then the storms came. Snow fell for days without stopping. Not gentle flakes, but violent sheets driven sideways by freezing wind. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The mountains disappeared entirely, swallowed by cloud and white. And with each storm, the realization grew heavier. They were running out of time. The final attempt. By early November, the party reached what is now known as Truckee Lake, later renamed Donner Lake. They had hoped to cross the final ridge before winter sealed it. They were too late. The pass ahead was buried under more than 5 feet of snow. Drifts rose higher than wagons. Trees snapped under the weight. The trail simply ended. They tried anyway. Men climbed ahead with shovels and axes, cutting steps into ice. Oxen were whipped forward, then beaten when they collapsed. Wagons were stripped, abandoned, broken apart for firewood. Still, they could not cross. On November 4th, after another failed attempt, they stopped. Not because they wanted to. Because they had no choice. That night, the snowstorm returned, heavier than ever before. By morning, every track they had made was gone. The Sierra Nevada had closed behind them. The party split into two main camps. One group built crude cabins near Truckee Lake using logs, wagon parts, and anything they could salvage. These became known simply as the Lake Camp. The second group, the Donner families, were several miles behind, trapped when their wagons broke during the final push. They built shelters near Alder Creek, small, miserable lean-tos made of pine boughs and hides. Between the two camps, more than 80 people faced the winter. They had almost no food, no resupply, no realistic hope of immediate rescue. Snow soon reached 10 feet deep. And it kept falling. At first, they rationed a little flour each day, some dried meat, a few beans boiled into thin soup. Then the oxen were slaughtered. Each animal was divided carefully. Meat dried when possible. Bones cracked for marrow. Hides boiled into gelatin. When the oxen were gone, they killed the horses. Then the dogs. Then the mice that crept into the cabins at night. George Donner's wife, Tamsin, later wrote, "We now eat hides, bones, and anything that will soften with boiling." Children cried from hunger. Mothers pretended not to hear. Men stopped speaking. Hunger does something strange to the human mind. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It creeps in. First as weakness, then as dizziness, then as obsession. Food became the only topic of conversation. People dreamed about it. Talked about meals they would eat in California. Described imaginary feasts in painful detail. Some began chewing bark. Others sucked on leather strips for hours. Still, the snow did not stop. In mid-December, a massive storm hit the mountains. For 6 straight days, snow fell non-stop. Cabins were buried to their roofs. Smoke holes clogged. Fires went out. People nearly suffocated in their sleep. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was unrecognizable. Cabins had to be dug out like graves. And with the storm came the knowledge everyone had been avoiding. They were not surviving this winter where they were. They needed help. Or they were all going to die. A desperate plan was formed. A small group would attempt to cross the mountains on foot, using crude snowshoes made from ox bows and rawhide. They would go for help. The group would later be known as the Forlorn Hope. 17 people volunteered, men and women. Some barely strong enough to stand. They left on December 16, 1846. As they walked away, those left behind watched silently. No one waved. No one spoke. They all understood something unspoken. This was either salvation, or a final goodbye. Back at the camps, starvation accelerated. People became skeletal. Skin stretched tight over bone. Eyes sank deep into their sockets. Children stopped playing. Adults stopped crying. One by one, people began to die, quietly, often in their sleep. They wrapped the bodies in blankets. At first, they buried them beneath the snow. Then the ground became too frozen. Bodies were left inside cabins, stacked in corners, covered with hides. And still, no one spoke the word everyone was thinking. It happened slowly. Not as a sudden act of madness, but as a grim, rational decision forced by biology. After several members of the Forlorn Hope died during their march, the survivors faced a terrible choice. They had no food left. They were days from civilization, if they could even make it. Louis Keseberg later testified. We could not endure longer. Death stared us in the face. They waited until night. They did not speak. They did not look at each other. They cut flesh from the dead. Cooked it. Ate it. This was not hunger anymore. This was survival stripped of morality. Weeks later, word had not yet reached the camps. But death had. At Truckee Lake, starvation claimed children first. Then women. Then men. Eventually, those still alive faced the same unbearable logic. When a body lay in the cabin, and there was nothing else to eat, and the snow showed no sign of melting, what choice remained? Some refused, and died. Others did not, and lived. There were no speeches. No arguments. Only silence. And the sound of boiling pots. By January 1847, the camps were places of ghosts. People barely moved. Fires burned low. The smell of death lingered beneath the pine smoke. Outside, the snow lay deeper than a man was tall. Inside, humanity was thinning. Yet still, somewhere beyond those mountains, help was coming. Slowly. Too slowly. In early February of 1847, word reached California settlements that a wagon party had gone missing in the mountains. The news was vague. No one knew exactly how many were trapped. No one knew how long they had been there. But rumors were already spreading. Men were organized. Supplies gathered. Snowshoes strapped on. The first relief party left Johnson's ranch on February 5. They climbed into the Sierra Nevada with fear in their hearts, and no idea what they were about to find. When they reached Truckee Lake weeks later, the scene stopped them cold. Cabins half buried in snow, smoke barely rising. No movement. At first, they thought everyone was dead. Then, a face appeared in a doorway. A human face, hollow-eyed, skeletal, barely alive. Inside the cabins, the rescuers saw things they would never fully describe. Children with swollen bellies from starvation, adults too weak to stand, bodies wrapped in blankets, lying beside the living. And signs. Bones that had been cracked open, pots scraped clean, flesh, unmistakably human. One rescuer later wrote, "I saw the marks, and I knew at once. God forgive them, I would have done the same." The rescuers did not ask questions. They did not accuse. They simply began pulling people out, one by one. But there was a problem. They could not take everyone. The snow was too deep, supplies too limited, time too short. Only the strongest could walk. Parents had to decide whether to leave children behind, hoping another rescue party would come. Some refused to leave at all. Others begged to go. Mothers handed over their children with shaking hands, whispering promises they weren't sure they could keep. As the first group descended the mountains, some looked back. They knew. They knew not everyone they left would still be alive when help returned. The second and third relief parties. More rescue parties followed. Each found fewer survivors. Each found more death. At Alder Creek, rescuers discovered the remains of the Donner families. George Donner was already dead, weakened by infection and starvation. Tamsen Donner refused to leave him. She sent her daughters ahead with rescuers, then turned back into the snow. She was never seen alive again. When her body was later found, there were signs. The rescuers understood. They did not speak of it publicly. Louis Keseberg. One name would come to represent the darkest shadow of the entire tragedy. Louis Keseberg. When rescuers found him, he was alone in a cabin, surrounded by human remains. He was alive. Others were not. Rumors spread quickly. That he had murdered for food, that he hoarded flesh, that he refused to share. Keseberg denied it all. He claimed he survived by chance, not cruelty. The truth was never fully proven. But history was not kind to him. Sometimes survival itself looks like guilt. The survivors were taken down from the mountains, fed slowly, washed, clothed, and then questioned. Newspapers seized the story. But they did not tell it gently. They exaggerated, they judged, they turned suffering into spectacle. The word cannibal appeared in headlines across the country. Survivors were stared at, whispered about, shunned. Some changed their names. Some never spoke of it again. Others tried, and were not believed. There were no criminal trials. No convictions. Authorities understood something the public refused to accept. This was not murder. This was starvation. Doctors testified that the human body, when pushed far enough, abandons morality in favor of survival. One physician wrote, "Hunger destroys reason before it destroys life." The official record closed. But the judgment did not. Many survivors never truly recovered. Children had nightmares for decades, adults avoided winter, some could not bear the smell of cooking meat ever again. A few spoke openly. Most did not. The mountains had taken something from them that could never be rescued. Over the years, people searched for meaning in the horror. Leadership failure. Poor decisions. Blind trust in Hastings. Ego over experience. Timing and environment. An early winter. Unpredictable weather. Geography that punished hesitation. Group psychology. How isolation breaks social rules, how survival reshapes morality. Dark folklore. Some locals believed the mountains were cursed, that winter spirits demanded sacrifice. No evidence supports the supernatural. But the fear remains. The mountains today. Donner Lake is peaceful now. Tourists swim, children laugh, snow falls gently in winter. Few realize what lies beneath. Not monsters. Not curses. But ordinary people, pushed past the breaking point. The Donner Party was not a story about evil. If this story stayed with you, if it unsettled you, remember. History doesn't need monsters. Sometimes, the nightmare is simply being human.